So inflation right now is in the news. It's talked about by all financial advisors. Every talking head on TV is talking about inflation. The Fed announced that they're going to raise rates and they're going to shrink their balance sheet. So the markets are reacting. They're reacting very negatively. We're in the midst of a correction. But the reality is inflation will likely not be a problem for a very long time. For sure, we have very high inflation rates right now, but that has mostly to do with government policy. When the government simply prints money and sends everyone a check, that's unearned checks, that in itself can create inflation. When we have supply chain disruptions, where supply cannot get to where it needs to go to be distributed, that's going to create inflation. Those are all concepts of supply and demand. However, what most companies do smartly is they will overorder. They will overorder their supplies. And as those supplies come in, the reverse takes place. Their inventories build up, and now they have too much inventory, and those inventories have cost. Usually, in many states, these companies have to pay taxes on their inventories. And as a result, they want to get rid of those inventory as quickly as possible. So when the reverse happens, when inventories build up and companies want to unload those inventories, they're adding supply, and as a result, inflation goes down. Now that's one part of this formula. The second part of the formula is we're always forgetting geopolitical events, right? Most inflation is measured by wages. And what everyone forgets is that we have countries like India, countries like China, and many other countries that are producing professionals at all levels. Particularly, the examples I like to give typically is doctors, engineers, specifically software engineers, mechanical engineers. And these folks are working towards what I call the American dream. They want to live the way Americans want to live. The standard of living in the US is much higher than the standard of living in most parts of the world. And they're willing to work at lower wages. These are deflationary forces that exist throughout the entire world, and they're not stopping. As a matter of fact, they're accelerating. In regards to what the government is doing right now, what the Fed specifically is doing right now, they've announced that they're going to raise rates. And they've announced that they may raise rates 5 times at a quarter point each. And there's some talk that maybe it's 6 times or 7 times or 8 times. What everyone forgets, by historical standards, even if all of those are true, by historical standards, we're still at historically low rates. Relative to the last 40 years, relative to the last 50 years. It's not a problem. It shouldn't be a problem. In the 1980s, early 80s, I was a mortgage broker. In my job, I had 2 mortgages to offer. I had a 15% mortgage, and I had a 16% mortgage, both with 7 points. I know it sounds obscene by today's standards because we're so used to the low rates, and people did fine. And in the 80s, that was the beginning of the greatest stock market boom ever in history, from 1980 to 2000. Presently, inflation is a direct result of poor government policy. The Fed has printed a little too much money. They've infused a little too much liquidity. Last year alone, the Fed infused over 30% more liquidity into markets in the world and the money supply. All of that is inflationary, but it's simply a function of government policy. With simple corrections, inflation will disappear, especially when you consider all of the deflationary forces that we've talked about.
Before investing, carefully consider the fund's investment objective, risks, charges, and expenses contained in the prospectus available at RUFFETF.com. Read carefully before investing.